Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, I like to discuss what Truss and Kwarteng need to do to get Tory MPs back on board with their budget, as explained by a Conservative MP in a pretty good position to do so. We'll all be discussing how credible their plan sounds to me as well. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, MPs preparing to go back to Westminster tomorrow. It's worth breaking down Truss's problems into root causes. It's easy to wave a dismissive hand around and claim that everything is a problem for her right now. It is. She's made a right balls up of things. But in the short term, her key problem is not the polls. It's not even the markets. And it's certainly not opposition parties. It's her parliamentary party. And this means there is a sort of a way back for her. In the short term. In the long term, I think she's buggered. But in the short term, I've talked quite a bit recently, and will do again, no doubt, as the week goes on, about how I see no good course of action for the Tories. But that's for the parliamentary party. Truss is the leader, and until the forces ranged against her become totally committed to her removal, and we're not there yet, she will always have a way out. Just like Boris Johnson did. Boris Johnson had a way out. When I said that he was finished from last December, that was based on the idea that I knew he wouldn't actually do what was necessary to save himself. Johnson could have changed direction no end of times. And if he had, he would still be Prime Minister now. He fell because he was too stubborn to change. Will Truss change direction, or is she too stubborn to change? Truss can claim that the polls right now are of no consequence, and once her brilliant economic plans come to fruition, those polls will turn right around in plenty of time for the election. If she could persuade Tory MPs of that, they would absolutely back her to the hilt. So the real issue is Tory MP confidence. The problem is they have no confidence. Truss has tried to insist that her plan will work. They're not convinced. When Good Cop didn't work, she tried to threaten them by explaining that she will remove the whip from anyone who voted against her budget. That wasn't going to work either. So now she's caving. She caved on the removal of the top tax band. She seems to be caving on the issue of inflation-linked universal credit increases as well. Ultimately, what any leader needs to do at any time, under any circumstances, is to listen to what MPs will back. Her attempts at both pressure and persuasion failed, so listening and talking are required. And as it happens, it seems we have a blueprint for what may do it. The head of the Treasury Select Committee, who is a Conservative MP, Mel Stride, has been writing exactly what she thinks Kwarteng needs to do to kickstart the budget into shape that Tory MPs can support. And she will surely know what Tory MPs will support. The first thing has already been discussed in various articles I've read. Currently, the government's fiscal rules dictate that they should reduce borrowing as a share of GDP, debts rather as a share of GDP, over the next 3 years. Not really possible to meet this rule with their insane tax cuts during a cost of living crisis and a global recession. So Stride suggests extending it to 5 years. Now, this is a cynical ploy, because it makes it sound like you've got a budget that gets borrowing under control over a reasonable period of time. I mean, who's going to complain about we've got this plan that means after 5 years we're balancing the books properly and actually, reducing debt. And that sounds fine. In isolation, that sounds fine. But in actual fact, what it means you're doing is you're going to increase debts now and leave the government that forms after the next election to work out how to reduce it again. Leave it for some other bugger to deal with your mess. If you imagine Labour winning that next election, you leave them with a massive bill and then accuse them of fiscal irresponsibility if they don't deal with it. It's dirty politics, but it works. The Tories aren't interested in playing fair, and nobody in politics should ever expect or even hope for fair play. The only question Kwarteng needs to ask is, will the markets accept the plan? If the answer is yes, then it's a no-brainer. It still means you're borrowing more to pay for tax cuts for the rich, which is a political problem when it comes to public opinion, but it will probably be a step towards satisfying investors. Stride also talks about the supply side reforms that the Treasury have been talking about. Now, this is a nonsense, by the way. Supply side reforms mean policies like that are to help businesses increase productivity and sales, basically. It's a way of making it easier for businesses to be productive. The number one problem for British businesses right now, according to them, is a labour shortage. Even Jacob Rees-Mogg is calling for more immigration to deal with the problem, but Home Secretary Suella Braverman is making it her mission to actually cut it down, or so she says anyway. So the number one problem for growth right now doesn't look like being improved anytime soon. The number two problem would be export barriers. The government have plans to make those even worse, certainly no better. So these supply side reforms are purely political, not economic. Kwarteng is going to try and persuade MPs that his investment zones will help businesses to grow. Of course they won't in any appreciable way. They will be akin to the news that the government are boasting about now that we can suddenly export lamb to the USA now for the first time in like 20 years. Great, nice one. Okay, good. Americans don't eat lamb, but, you know, for the very small number who do, great, fantastic. But thanks for trying. And this will be the same thing. They'll get figures which show a small theoretical boost to growth, if you exclude certain factors, of course, and you don't mind the economic and environmental damage to the wider country that will come of it. But it won't generate growth for the country. It may generate a little bit of extra growth for the individual regions that have it, but for the overall country, it'll come down. You know, and when the data comes out in a year or two, it will show that. But the government don't need the actual data to be good, only the projected data. In terms of winning Tory MPs over, nonsensical supply side reforms could work as long as it doesn't piss the public off or the markets. It won't piss the markets off because investors don't care. They won't be losing out. And whether it pisses off the public will depend, because actually what's really going to... It's not the economic nonsense of these investment zones that's actually going to cause the government problems by the look of it. It's the environmental damage. I've already said, pun intended, it's got the RSPB spitting feathers, but the National Trust now is attacking it very robustly as well. They've got over 5 million members, and those members are basically the middle classes, you know, your Tory voters, a lot of them. So, you know, that may be what does it in the end. But the public may or may not, you know, mind it. It might be too airy-fairy for most people. Stride tackles the issue of spending cuts and points out that they're not actually feasible. But again, she points to the room allowed if the fiscal rules of debt reduction over 5 years rather than 3. You know, in other words, she's urging him to borrow heavily to be able to afford his budget of tax cuts, which do nothing apart from for the rich, in a way that persuades investors that it'll still be reined in later on when the growth allows for it. She knows this is economically reckless and even hints at it in the article, but she is above all a Tory MP, and what she's trying to do is come up with a political plan that lets Kwarteng and Truss off the hook without looking like massive cretins. She's not actually interested in the strength of the UK economy. There is, of course, a small flaw in her plan. I'm sure I don't need to explain what it is. Stride also talks about creating new taxes to cover the tax cuts in this budget. This is a common enough Tory trick. Take, for example, the cut to income tax. Although they've dropped the removal of the upper tax band, the lower tax band has been reduced from 20% to 19%. That measure will stay because there's no major political resistance to it. The Tories are presenting it as a tax cut, and it certainly sounds like a tax cut, doesn't it? But the Resolution Foundation worked out that it's actually a tax rise, and you go, hey, how does that work? They've cut it, haven't they? Well, the reason is because the Tories have frozen the expected increase in the tax allowance, which is the amount you earn before paying any tax. So the overall level of tax you pay is actually going up. So what they've done is they've frozen the tax allowance, meaning you pay tax on more of your earnings, and they've lowered one of the bands of tax a little bit by only half as much, and then they're calling that a tax cut. Classic Tory trick. Classic. And this is what they do all the time. They'll give you a fiver while they nick a tenner from your back pocket. It's why we have the highest tax burden since just after the Second World War. And yet they'll carry on calling themselves the party of low taxation. Stride is basically arguing for the same fiddle here. Drop a well-known tax and say, oh, we're cutting your taxes here, that's more money in your pocket, you know what I mean? And then recoup it with stealth taxes elsewhere so that people still have less in their pocket, but they won't tie it to the government because they'll just think it's from increases in the costs of other things. It's cynical. But just like a move to shift the debt reduction programme from 3 years to 5 years, actually it'll probably work. It'll satisfy city traders. You could probably sell it to the public. who won't pay attention to the details. She even suggests that as fuel bills come down in a couple of years, you could add an additional tax on that. Partly packaged, she says, and that's the word she used, packaged, as a green levy, she says. So those are the basic proposals of a Tory MP with a keen interest in economic matters. Remember, she's the Treasury Select Committee chair. So she's paid attention to economic matters. She's considered to have a decent amount of knowledge on these things. And she is the one trying to make the Conservative Party look credible. And she is basically advocating stealth taxes and more borrowing, with even more taxes to be added on in a couple of years, and hoping that growth allows the tax revenues to naturally grow within a year or two as well. Can it be sold to Tory MPs politically? If it works to calm the markets down, yes. It also has the added bonus of making Kwarteng's budget look largely intact and plausible, even though it's a sham. But would Kwarteng and Truss actually go for it? Now, I've not seen anything to suggest either of them care about the extra borrowing. Seems pretty clear they don't mind piling more debt on. Their backers in the media have been pointing out that most of the G7 have a higher debt to GDP ratio than we do, which is true, but it's also more affordable for them than it is for us. But the point is they could still sell this to the public. You know, what do Truss and Kwarteng really feel about taxes? Do they really want to reduce taxes, or is it just a sham? Because the plan involves extra taxes, stealth taxes, an overall higher level of taxation. The old Tory dodge. But claiming that they're a low tax, so they lower a well-known tax, raise less well-known ones. You know, what will they do? It looks like, as I said at the start, Truss is caving on the idea of benefits now. She may have to raise them in line with inflation, not wages. But will they do this, or are they too determined to stick to their ideological aims and to hell with the consequences? I mean, I suspect they'll have no choice in the short term. We will see. If Tory rebels get behind these ideas, Kwarteng will have to accept them, I guess. Then the question turns to Labour. Can they show people that it's a plan that means giving with one hand and taking with the other? Possible. After all, the public right now, they know that they don't like the budget in its current form. The plan keeps the budget largely in its current form. The major legwork would be needed by the Tories to prove that it is somehow different enough to tilt it from what pissed people off and what caused their higher mortgages as well. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. If you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.